Today we have someone who describes himself as a public policy analyst. As he's also an author based in Pune. So I think you'll hear a lot of words starting with P in this conversation. He also helps run a management consulting business for a French multinational. And though he's known for politics, policy, and even poha, today we are going to talk a little bit about what makes Ashish Chandorkar so prolific in various themes. And in fact, Ashish is someone that we met about a decade ago. We were in fact all working on the same floor. And Ashish has grown on from there to do several things. So we want to get a peek behind the scenes as to what makes Ashish tick. So Ashish, welcome to this CTQ Smartcast.
Thank you, Raman, and thank you, Harish, for having me.
Tell us a little bit about how, if you look back at the last decade especially, carved out different personas in some sense. You found some element of compartmentalization. So looking back, what made you embrace these channels? Was it very natural? Or was it a very deliberate attempt because you saw the potential of these channels and you said, this is something I must be part of?
Yeah, I think I must say that it all started with my move to Pune. I moved here in 2004. Indian services industry, if you work in that field, basically you get fairly abstracted from the society in some ways because your lifestyle is very attuned to, let's say, a calendar which runs in the US or Europe or wherever you are working typically, be it holidays or be it your own lifestyle, late night calls. So basically the whole, if you compare the life that we have from the previous generation of our parents, our life has been fairly different, at least in the initial parts of our career, right, who have worked in the services industry. And in fact, some of what we were doing probably couldn't even be explained to our parents or our relatives, right? Like people don't understand that I'm going to call and please do not call me or please do not SMS me or disturb me. So those kind of things. So I think the life was fairly in the same vein. Even for me, it was fairly monotonous and fairly unidirectional until I came to Pune. The good thing was that in the first 3-4 years, obviously I was a stranger to the city, didn't know much about the history, etc. But then Twitter happened in 2008-9. And through that, I met a lot of very interesting folks in the initial years. I think what went right for me was that I actually met a lot of people face to face very early on, like when this was not very popular. People used to talk about tweet ups, and I mean, tweet ups used to be like a rarity. There used to be like big events called tweet ups, etc. I got down to meeting several folks very early on, and I think that really helped me. Firstly, to understand that there's a lot to know even just around me. If I look at Pune as a city, I live in a part of the city where probably a very historic battle was fought in just over 200 years ago, where the British really took control over India around that, defeating the Marathas in the Third War. The battle, it started in 1817, ended in 1818. The point is that some of those things were really fascinating. And one thing led to another. I met more folks with a lot of interest in science and history and in geography. I think that really helped me rethink that there's more to life than doing 10 p.m. calls and then 7 a.m. call followed by a 7 a.m. call. Thankfully, there was also a time in between where I did have some time at hand because of some circumstantial situations in the work profile where I was traveling, and I had a fairly easy few months, let's say, where I could really explore some of this. So it all fell in place naturally. But I would credit this to Twitter, and of course, then I carried from there. I actually then thought I should read more, understand more, spend more time. And then, of course, the whole public policy thing I started participating in after a couple of years. Yeah, I think it was a chance occurrence, but I think once you really think about it very hard, and you guys are prime examples, you were working in a corporate situation yourself, and then you went on to basically carve a niche, a very important niche for yourself, which a lot of people wouldn't have thought about it. So I think in that sense, a lot of examples were there around me also, and it was quite fascinating, and that kind of led me to thinking that I should do something else also, not just that I should stop working, which I couldn't do unlike you guys, but not as much of a risk taker, I must say. But the fact was that it helped me broaden my horizons, and it's been a very fulfilling journey, I would say, in the last 7-8 years.
Okay. While we are on this topic of different styles of or how careers have changed, in fact, it's probably even not the right word to use in the singular, because I think a lot of us now can legitimately said to be pursuing different interests in a blended sort of fashion. It is not the old fashioned words like balance or 9 to 5, 5 to 9. It's all one big blend. And I think in the last 6 months, a lot of people are experiencing that for first hand as well, in a way that a lot of you and your like managed to do. Talk us through this, living this blended lifestyle in some sense, wherein you could be doing something related to, say, thinking about public policy that does happen occasionally between 9 to 5. And in a similar way, what you do, which is considered your LinkedIn day job, also happens outside that time. So what is it like? Is this the way things will be, or are you an outlier?
Yeah, I think very good point, Harish. I think, Raman, we think about our careers in a very unidirectional way where concepts like work-life balance, 9 to 5 job, switching on, switching off. I think some of that has never been relevant really. If you really look back on your own careers, let's say over last 15, 20 years, the fact is that all of us have done odd stuff, right? We have taken breaks during the day and we've done a 2 a.m. calls. So it's not that we were always really conscious about it. It's just that we were not accepting of the fact that the work day need not has to be cut and dry 8 hours. And I think some of that comes from legacy of how work life is seen in India. But the fact is that the balance actually was never there in a true sense, right? So the way I approach it is that it's not about, you can be task oriented and you can still devote a full time or full concentration or full focus on a given task. But the tasks need not be arrayed by, let's say, an 8 hour work day. You can basically, anyway, if you are doing something which really necessitates you to work late in the night, then might as well take a half an hour off elsewhere to basically just make sure that you don't lose time for yourself. What I mean to say is that in the pursuit of a long work day, you shouldn't really cut down on other things or other hobbies, just waiting for things to happen. If you really analyze our work styles, what happens is that because all of us probably work 10, 12 hours a day, the fact is that 3, 4 hours a day, you're just doing nothing and just waiting for things to happen, right? Someone is supposed to send you an email or a document is being prepared. You are doing one part of it. Someone is collating it. So there are actually enough empty spaces in a day which you can use productively, and which is what I've been focusing on, not to really using blinkers to say that for 8 hours I'll do nothing else, and for 4, 5 hours I'll only do what I want to do. I think both the lives, quote unquote, are intertwined in that sense. I think what also helps is that because I work in the consulting field where a broad view of life is generally useful. The more you know about what's happening in the industry, policies, what's happening in different countries, best practices, stories. I think some of that is anyway professionally useful to me, right? And as you grow in the corporate hierarchy, the life becomes less task oriented and more basically decision oriented or impact oriented, where you are basically doing stuff which is going to make a big difference. It may not take 8 hours a day, but even a 8 minutes a day decision can make a big difference to the context in which you're operating. So I think in that sense, it works well. The fact that I can then use my other interests to bring in the relevant information to my work life also is quite exciting and a unique proposition in that sense. I think some of the conversations I have are quite interesting at work also, because people don't expect that to come from, let's say, a vendor or someone who's working in an advisory capacity. So I think it's actually quite useful. Contrary to, I don't see that as a waste of time. I see that as a good tailwind to what I anyway, like you said, to my LinkedIn job. But I think that synergy needs to be explored. Again, the context could be very different for different people. Not to say that everyone will fit into what I am saying or in my definition, but at least in my definition or in my industry, I could make that dual thing happen fairly productively.
So why do you think more people aren't doing what you're doing? People are still very hesitant. There is this compartmentalization as that by default. So what explains that?
Absolutely. I think, see, one thing, Raman, is that people don't realize that, at least let's say people at our age, let's say, or I would say 35 to 45 years bracket, right? I actually don't think those folks will retire in the same job or in the same industry where they are. And I think they don't realize it. Even in the next 5, 10 years, the nature of the jobs can be fairly different, right? From how we see it. And I think events like the pandemic may only expedite some of that transformation. In fact, a lot of people actually are in the business of giving that gyan to others, but they don't apply it to themselves. You may go and tell your clients that you should do this, you should change this way, that way. But the fact is that you don't apply it to your own life sometimes. I think the real reason is that people don't know how to basically productively either monetize or basically get the sense of satisfaction. It's okay to, let's say, for example, if I want to write something, but if I don't get published in a reasonably important place, then I don't get that intellectual satisfaction of having written something, right? It's not just about writing your own blogs, etc. So I think that gap, people don't know how to bridge sometimes. And I guess any profession or like any interest, it only comes with practice and it only comes with some discipline. So it's not that you can't do it, just that people are probably not aware of those options, etc. And also because people don't take it so seriously. I actually firmly believe that, let's say if I were to work 15 more years, I may not retire from the industry that I'm today working in otherwise. I will be doing something else only after 15 years. So if I don't create a base now, I may not have that the real professional / monetization opportunities, and let's say in the last 5 years of my career, right? So I think that realization people may not have most of the times, and I actually think that's a gap for most people.
So you mentioned the people in the age group of 35 to 45 suffer from this. Do you think the younger folks, people who are just entering their work lives, because of the fact that they have lived there most of their educational career or life in these last few years, do they, in your opinion, look at things differently then?
I think some of them do, in the sense that I see two differences. One is that if I compare our, let's say, the broad generation, which I mentioned, I think we were far too engaged and involved with that single job that we had. And we used that as a leverage to practically achieve everything else in life. For us, that was like the end all of it. So you had a very linear vision. Let's say if you were in the IT industry, you knew that you had to go on site. You had to make some savings in dollars or euros or some other currencies so as to basically improve your quality of life. So basically the view was a fairly well-defined one. And once it got disrupted in the 2007-2008 era, when the previous crisis hit us in the global financial crisis, I think at that point, some of us made adjustments, others did not make adjustments. And I think some of them are still, I would say, suffering. So people who were 25 years old in 2008 may actually have lost track in 2020 in some ways, right? They may be doing stuff which is much below their real potential because they did not adjust to the reality which dawned between 2008 and 2011-12, when the world really got rebalanced in a professional sense. I think that tendency is a little less, I would say, in the next generation. I think people, and it could be a little bit negative in a different way. I think, see, we were far too involved in the jobs. The new generation seems far too detached from the jobs, right? They almost take it lightly, like a set of activities to be done, and then you basically switch off. It's almost like a polar opposite situation. But however, that enables them to then concentrate on other things, be it hobbies or be it learning. And I think the smarter of the lot obviously know that once you complete your engineering or whatever graduation you're doing or MBA, that is not the end of learning. That is just the end of formal education. But the learning really, and you guys are in that business actually, so I shouldn't be preaching to the choir here. But the fact is that the learning, I think some of those people realize is better and are probably more invested in formally and informally addressing that skill set, which I think our generation wasn't. I really think that a lot of us basically relied on the very thin and skeletal corporate support for upskilling ourselves, which really companies were never interested in because there were commercial issues and issues of losing time, and time essentially in the services industry, time is money, right? So you don't want to lose time. So I think a lot of people have really not kept up with what's happening in the world. But the previous generation, even for a negative reason, that the fact that they are not as invested in their jobs, may be able to do that once, let's say, a negative event, a life event strikes them. And the smarter ones will probably just do it on their own. So I see that difference and a little bit more hope for the future in an informal skill augmentation sense, which I think we missed out on.
In general, do you think there is a trend towards this individualization of professional work, in the sense that now you have a reason to build a personal brand? You take charge of your learning, upskilling. For example, the corporate treadmill is no longer to be relied on, or it doesn't completely provide what you need, and therefore all the other trends like blending in of other fields like culture, for example, and we're seeing that play out in the West a lot, wherein culture bleeds into what you do, affects almost, there's no strict compartmentalization. So this individualization, this consumerization, looking at yourself as an individual node, is that shaping the way a lot of these things are playing out?
Yes, I think so. See, I think the corporate gyms have become very crowded. The reason is that when industries don't grow at a supernormal pace, like they did in, let's say, the peak of globalization between 1998 and say 2008, or maybe 2011, even if we extend it by a few years. I think that era of globalization and the world trying to shrink is over for different reasons. And of course, this is not to say that opportunities will not exist, but the opportunities will get limited, and they've already got limited due to various factors like geopolitics and the sense of different countries to be more preservationist and look inwards and basically ensure that their populations do not suffer on account of real or optical issues arising out of globalization. So in that sense, the irreversibility has already set in, and I think a pandemic like this may actually accelerate that process even in other areas, even outside of, let's say, services or labor movement, etc. And even for goods movement and capital movement, I think those restrictions may become even more stricter. So in that sense, yes, once the corporate space shrinks, You just basically run faster on the treadmill to just stay wherever you are. It may not necessarily take you any forward just because you were running harder. You also see that also means that, let's say if you had a fairly linear view of your career, that after 10 years you should achieve something, 15 years after you should achieve something, you may not get there, not because you were not good, but just because that space wasn't available for whatever reason. And of course, in any corporate setup, like we know, it's not about just personal competence, but there's a lot of situational exogenous factors which also matter. Politics, context of your industry, context of your company, for example. So all of that is also very critical. And all of that is not in your hands. And just because you work, you can work harder, you can create a delta of, let's say, 2 hours a day. That's not going to impact the outcome, because really that's not in your hands. The outcome is being the factors which are influencing the outcome may completely be out of your control. So in that sense, because that realization or that situation is there, I would say that it is almost mandatory, or it should be really, people should really step back and think about this harder, which people aren't doing, probably, as we said, as we discussed, that not enough people are putting time into it and time and effort into it. In the sense that you cannot rely on the corporate context to realize your own dreams or your own potential, or just basically do what you like to do or stay happy with. So I think that blend of things has to come in the thought process at some point of time.
Just to build on that, a lot of these things relate to optionality. Earlier, it was just a single career you had. Therefore, someone who set the stage for you and said, walk out and do this. And increasingly, there is this, as we see it, a lot of these looking at a career not as a ladder, but let's say jungle gym has been one such metaphor used, or looking at something like a network. I think networks being a very crucial role in preserving this. How are you seeing the role of networks in the life of professionals, knowledge workers especially?
Yeah, and I think the networks play a tremendous role. I think people don't appreciate enough how just by staying in touch with diverse set of people, you can improve yourself in terms of your knowledge, your worldview, your perspective on a given area. But also you can actually use it productively in a professional sense also. Like, for example, Twitter is a classic example, right? Like some of the stuff which I had no clue about, like for example, Pune's history or the rich traditions and legacy of the city where I was living in for 3-4 years, quite oblivious to the fact of that a lot happened around me and certainly in the city. I had no idea, but only when the network got created. And in fact, some of the social media actually was very useful in that sense, where the first set of people you knew or you followed or you spoke to were the ones you did not know in real life. And that medium really facilitated the process of discovering people who were quite knowledgeable and experts in their own limited areas. But you wouldn't have met them otherwise because there was no life context overlap with many of those people. So I think in that sense, I think that networking personally has really helped me a lot. And I feel that if you really have, let's say, a set of people who you can rely upon to take advice from, or just pick their brains, or simply just observe them. I think a lot of learning happens simply by observation. You don't really have to know someone in person, but I think that is very critical. And yet again, in the corporate setup, corporates are not designed for networking. In fact, corporates are generally designed, like in the modern management theory, if you go back to the Drucker principles and stuff like that, a lot of it has become a task-oriented type of a model, right? Where you are working in a limited context. You could be specialized worker, you could be doing something very unique in your own right, which is fine. But that doesn't afford you the luxury of talking to different people who are not doing what you are doing. You may know tens of people who do exactly what you do, but you may know very few people who do not who do exactly the opposite of what you are doing, or something very different in a different area, even in your own industry or in your own company, right? So because the whole modern corporate life was based on a, let's say, first in an assembly line type of a model, and then work specialization then took over from there. I think the networks have to be informal enough to really break that chain, and for that you need to take some effort. Basically, I mean, it's not going to happen on its own, but you need to figure out who the people are who you can learn from and who you can really tap into for your other interest areas.
So you're someone that we see as a great example of someone who's built a deliberate curiosity diet. That's what it looks to us, and assembling sources of information, whether it be these informal networks, or I'm sure like the books behind you tell their tale. There's a reading habit behind it. And a lot of this is expressed in what you then put out, because it cannot be something which is a passing or a stray thought. It is informed from various sources. So just talk to us a little bit about if you were to look at it as a curiosity diet, what goes into it? And similarly, what have omitted over the years or excised over the years?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think we all will realize that ultimately there's a mental capacity in which you operate, and also like a mental space in which you operate, right? So there's also a life outside of learning and skilling and improvement and all of that, and work. So there's a personal life also. So basically you have to be very careful about what areas do you dabble in and where you show the humility of not dabbling in, or deliberately cut down on stuff. I used to be an avid cricket buff and a Bollywood buff. In fact, there was a time when I used to watch every movie that released. I used to practically live in E Square in let's say between 2006, 2005 and 2009, 10. I was practically just living in E Square every weekend, 2-3 movies a week. So I had to actually cut down on almost all of that. I now only watch Salman Khan movies because, Bhai rocks, irrespective of whatever else he does in his personal life. But in Salman Khan movies, I don't watch practically any Bollywood, except on flights. Sometimes I can quickly catch up on some of the interesting stuff which is released. But I consciously took a part to, and then on cricket again, I stopped watching a lot of the Ranji Trophy stuff and Zimbabwe versus Sri Lanka type match, which I used to very passionately follow in earlier years. So now I am on cricket. I'm still very much clued in, but not in the sense of watching every ball that's being balled around the world, or following it up in a live score sense, etc. So I do watch cricket and football in a very limited sense, but I do keep a track by reading. But yes, so that was my first kind of response to the time equation, that basically focus on areas which, if I was interested in, let's say, history or economics or public policy, then let me focus there. I can only watch so many movies with that kind of a diverse interest set. I think even on social media, I actually stay away from things I don't understand. Like, for example, I stay away from outrages. So social media can actually be a good concoction of self-delusion. So, for example, if you were always commenting on the event of the day, you may get a lot of traction by writing something completely bizarre or something, just basically putting fuel to the fire. But the fact is, and a lot of people actually thrive on that because that's their validation from the society that I said something and people read it, or even if they didn't read it, they shared it or favorited it or retweeted it, whatever medium you are on. So the fact is that I stay away from that because it's a time sink. Outrages always exist, and there's a new outrage of the day every day. That's how the social media works, right? So if you really get into like crimes and outrages and trying to prove a point by having long debates, I think it doesn't lead anywhere. And I think, again, that was also a readjustment. I think to some extent I may have done that in the first few years, but I realized pretty quickly that the place, it's okay to basically talk to people who you think understand the subject, but otherwise it's okay to focus on using it as a, let's say, a broadcast medium to large extent, but also to read, very importantly. You don't have to prove that you're reading. Unfortunately, on social media, if you've not posted, people don't believe it. But for example, a lot of people say that I am very active on social media. Yes, but the fact is that is because I'm actually reading a lot of stuff and I'm not writing about it. So I'm only have 15 tweets a day, but I may have actually read 150 articles of Twitter in a given day, right? So that I don't have to prove that to anyone. I think once you understand that thing, that you're doing it for yourself and not to basically make a point to the world or to get someone else's attention or validation, I think that's when it becomes more fulfilling.
In fact, maybe a modern Zen master would say, if a tree has fallen in a forest but no one has tweeted about it, has the tree.
True.
So tell us a little bit about the reading side of, what is it like these days? How has that shifted over time?
I used to read, I think from a book reading perspective, I've been fairly consistent. I have never been a big fiction fan in that sense. I do read fiction basically to break the monotony of what I'm otherwise reading. So I do catch up with all the popular stuff like Dan Brown or Chetan Bhagat or Amish Tripathi. I've read every of their books basically, and it's fine. Even if people have this very cut and dried view that something is either whether you make money out of it or something is intellectually satisfying. I don't think either is necessary really to justify what you're doing. I read this in the context of basically, I think even Dan Brown books have been quite instrumental in piquing my curiosity on European history, for example. And since I traveled to Europe almost, well, I used to before the Chinese intervened. Since I travel 4-5 times a year to Europe, I think it's actually been quite useful even to read Dan Brown in that sense, right? Which is otherwise derided as a pulp fiction or glorification of useless concepts by several critics, which is fine. It's part of people's job to critic also. But I read a lot of non-fiction. I think my ratio would be 80-20 basically in terms of fiction, non-fiction. It could be 90-10 now. It has probably become more skewed in that sense. And I read largely around history, economics, current events, some science here and there, not a lot, but a little bit here and there on the science side also. So the book reading wise, I have been fairly consistent in that sense. The other reading, which is the daily reading, I have changed significantly. What I've done is I've realized that reading a lot of popular stuff or what's, let's say, a page ranked by Google as relevant may not actually be very relevant. I actually rely on a few sources. So just what I've done is I use Feedly as the source of my daily reading. I have configured Economic Times, Livement, and Financial Express, which I think are the three relevant business papers, and they are fairly broad in their coverage. So it's not just hardcore economics, but I think ET is the best newspaper in India. They have actually got a fairly broad coverage of even politics, for example. Their writers are fairly clued in, and they do good stuff on even defense and stuff like that. So I actually use ET as my base reading for the day, but also I've configured Livement, Financial Express, and Jagran on my Feedly. And Jagran, because I think Hindi heartland, and since I come from MP and I grew up reading Hindi papers, I still read a lot of Hindi news. So outside of that, I also read a lot of the Dainik Bhaskar, and I also follow 7-8 handles on Twitter to basically just keep a track of what's really happening in the hinterland. So I think that's my base for the day typically. And I think that would form, let's say, about 50-60 articles, which I don't have to read every word of, but I basically go through to understand what's happening. Then on top of that, I track Pune and Indore very closely every day. So in terms of what's happening in daily news. I actually feel that I still know more about Indore than I know about Pune, despite I think in 6 years' time, the time I spend in the two cities will equalize. But I think just in terms of tracking, I think I'm closer even today to Indore than I am to Pune in that sense. But I think this is very critical that you understand that you cannot read everything, and there's no point in getting overwhelmed by it. Like in the initial days of Twitter, or when people used to talk about a lot of stuff, like whole range of things. Like this one guy is talking about science, someone is talking about literature, someone is talking about some arbitrary cricket record. And you may actually could have got a little lost and actually even unnerved by the fact that you did not know all of that stuff. And that's fine. The fact is that unlike the two of you who know a lot of stuff about a lot of things about a lot of things, most people will not get there, right, in their life. So I think I kind of compromise with the thing that, okay, fine, let me just narrow down on these 3-4 sources and continue to basically follow that. And once that happens, then you can get a little bit disciplined about it also. So for example, I know that on Sunday, I'm reading the columns of Shankar Iyer or Swapan Dasgupta, or when Open magazine releases a new edition, I know when it is going to come out. So I quickly look for, let's say, what Siddharth Singh is writing in Open, stuff like that. So I think a mental map emerges over, let's say, a couple of years of practice, and then you can fine tune that.
Right. I think one thing that we've definitely noticed that you do is not be very apologetic about things like you're a Salman Khan fan. Not too many people might not just say that, but it's the debate that you brought up, right? About the being seen as intellectual versus you can do a lot of things simultaneously. I think the same is true of following, for example, local news. Not seen as cool earlier. If you couldn't talk about, say, the Premier League, but you knew about what's happening in your backyard, wasn't considered cool enough. And I think that one thing that we've seen you do is walk away from those kinds of debates and not worry too much about it.
Yeah. I think the real point here is that, in my view, you should not use social media as a tool for validation. The validation really comes from the whole of what you do in your own life, and some of it may only be visible to you. The moment you start making everything visible to the world and then seek their opinion or their validation or their approval of your thoughts, etc., I think that is where the problem lies. Like when you try to fit in with a set of people. In fact, I think on every issue that I think I'm passionate about, I may have fair amount of differences even with the folks who think are on the same side, for example. So like even as a base case, let's look at Bollywood. A lot of people are not happy. People are actually very scared about saying that they are Salman Khan fans. But so be it. I actually don't care so much about the fact that I've actually practically watched all of his movies, and I still do. And the thing is that you need to also separate in that case the person from the actor, right? So it's not that because I'm a Salman Khan fan, so I have to endorse what he does in his real life. Actually, I don't care what he does in real life. As long as someone is making movies and I can watch it, it's fine. If he doesn't make movies, that is also fine. It's not really going to make much of a difference for me in that sense. But I think that is where the social media gets a little edgy, where people get into a 0-100 debate, right? It's a binary thing that, okay, if you're a Salman Khan fan, you have to basically endorse everything that Salman Khan has done in his personal life, which actually I don't endorse and I don't really care about. It's beyond a point. It's for him to really, who am I to judge? I think the less people judge and the less people seek validation. I think that's where the change happens. It's not easy, and it wasn't easy for me either. Not to say that I did not behave exactly the opposite. I think I did for a while. But once you realize that the sum total of what you are as a person and that may not really be known to anyone apart from you really, or you are someone who's like really close to you, your family, friends, etc. I think that's good enough. But that's a hard transition, definitely.
So since we're midway through this conversation and you brought up Bollywood and cricket, that I don't know if you remember, but you did a quiz a couple of times for our floor, and that was around, one was Bollywood and one was cricket. Why don't we turn the tables a little bit and pay you back? We have a couple of questions for you, Ashish, and Harish hasn't really seen these questions, so if you want to use him as a sounding board, you can do that. And since we also spoke about reading and reading regularly, one of the things that we have is we bring together people to read every day. So we are going to, for every question you get right, we're going to give you a prize, which is not for you, but you can give it to someone else later. Okay, so that's what's at stake today. The stakes are really high. So, okay, first question we have to start with. Now I have a personal connection in life with Indore. I know a few things about Indore now, so I can claim. I'm going to ask you about two friends from Indore, but I want you to tell me their mutual friend's father-in-law. So this is already a complicated question, right? So the two friends are Virender Singh Vyas, who was son of a Jagirdar at Khajrana, and Jai Singh Rao Kalevar, who was a vegetable farmer. They were friends. They had a third very good friend. I want you to tell me who this third friend's father-in-law is. So, we are talking about connecting the dots here. So,
Khajrana, is it?
Yeah. Virender Singh Vyas and from Khajrana and Jai Singh Rao Kalevar were good friends in college. They had a third friend who's obviously much more famous, and that person for sure. And this person's father-in-law is what we're looking for. Harish will help you. He'll be your son.
I actually I have no idea.
I don't know if Harish has
tell the answer actually.
No, I don't know the answer, but I think I can give you some hints probably if that is right. So the names sound like Jay and Viru, and okay. Going by your I'm going to go somewhere near Salim Javed. Now you will have the Indore spice to it to get to the right answer.
I see. Indore has had a lot of Bollywood connection actually. So it's like a lot of right from Salman Khan himself, for example. but the whole bunch of Bollywood folks have got Indore connection. So
let's ask you to first identify the person, then we can talk about.
Yeah.
So you guys are very close. So who's the friend, the third friend? Look at the names. Yeah, look at the names are Virender Singh and Rao.
Jay and Viru.
So the friend is, I think Harish mentioned Salim Khan. Okay, good. Okay. So that's one. That's the third friend, and he used these two names because he distinct the actors. So who's Salim Khan's father-in-law? What's the name of Salim Khan's father? Hazard a guess. Same universe.
Salim Khan's father-in-law. Yeah, I know. Actually, I know it's about personal life, but never thought about his father-in-law.
And we've all heard of this father-in-law. That's the beauty of the answer. So
Salim Khan's father.
Universe of Shunli.
Exactly. Hari Singh.
That would have been an even perfect answer. Unfortunately, no.
Is it Amjad Khan?
It's not Amjad Khan. It's a character from the movie.
The first character.
So Salim Khan's father-in-law was actually a Thakur. Let's put it that way.
Baldev Singh.
Yeah, Thakur Baldev Singh. So that's the other inspiration for.
Yeah, I think I thought of Hari Singh because it was it's one of the favorite Sholay questions for people.
That's the problem of knowing, right? Okay, I'm just going to pause here briefly it's raining crazily here.
Correct.
Close the window just a second.
Sure. I will close the doors as well.
It's quite bad here. I'm surprised how you hear rain from your side, Ashish. actually went on mute.
I'm back. It's quite crazy actually.
Yeah.
It's very
This might be
noisy.
the heaviest rain of the season actually.
All right. So we'll go to the next question, Ashish. And here's your question. This is from the world of energy, which we know you track quite closely. There's an author called Václav Smil, professor. You may have heard of him. He's a Czech Canadian professor. Book saying that I wait for his new books just the way some people wait for the next Star Wars movie. So he's written a lot of books on energy. So whose quote is this?
Raman, I think I can't hear much because the connection is not the best right now.
Okay.
Just 1 second.
Let me. Sure. No problem. We'll do it again.
Let me also switch to my mobile. Might be.
Yeah.
Harish, you can hear me?
It was a bit garbled.
Okay. Maybe it was.
Yeah, I think let's continue. Let's see. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. Yeah. Moving on to the next question, since you're interested in energy. So, Smil, a professor on energy. And so who once said about Smil, I wait for his new books just the way some wait for the next Star Wars movie.
Just the way people wait for Star Wars.
Yeah, for the Star Wars movie. I think Ramanand's connection is a bit weak, Ashish, because
Yeah, no, I heard the question. I think that was Bill Gates.
I also don't know. I haven't seen the question.
Okay, so this is someone famous whose efforts in philanthropy and a lot of other things these days are making more headlines than what he used to do earlier.
Yeah, Ashish said Bill Gates. Raman.
He said, okay.
Yeah.
Bill Gates is absolutely right. Well done. That's Bill Gates. So that's the second question out of the way. And the third and last question is that, so Joseph Dash, whose name is important to this answer, he was an electrical engineer, later turned a policy think tank kind of guy. So he died at 43 in an air crash. So he was a libertarian. And he said that think tanks should take on the role of doing something which governments usually can't do or can't afford to do. So a concept is associated with Joseph Dash. The concept, I know you've spoken about it a few times as well.
So that's the Overton window. It's ironic that I did not know the Bollywood one, but I knew the two more complex answers, which kind of have the shift from in the last few years.
That's true. It's appropriate, and I think it also tells you that there's always a lot more. In fact, one reason that I knew a little bit about the Overton window, I've seen it appear in some of your tweets and your writings, and I think in some sense we're living in times where the window is just shifting. I think we can also experience the effects of the Overton window. All right, a few more questions before we close up. So just going back to the world of the knowledge worker of the past, the present, and the future. Clearly, media skills are playing a role these days, especially in the last 6 months. If you like it or not, if you're on Zoom and you're in front of a video, it's a bunch of skills that you have to rewire yourselves for. And in some sense, you made a shift a while ago because we became comfortable with writing for public outlets, and going on podcasts is something that you now do very routinely. You also guest host podcasts. If you look at just taking a cue from Scott Adams' idea of the talent stack, right? Things that you need to be in the top 25%, maybe in your organization, if not in the world. What would a future stack for a knowledge worker look like? What are the things that someone should try and deliberately add to be relevant in the future?
Yeah, I think I've always believed that there are some basic skills which people need to have, irrespective of what they study as a professional career or whatever they do in their to make a living. I think areas like economics, behavioral science / economics type stuff, a little bit of psychology and appreciation of history and geography. I think those are the skills which I think people should really add. What is happening is that I think we have all realized that since I think all of us have really moved around quite a bit in our lives, even within India, if not outside of, and just traveled a little bit. I think what I observe is that our reading of the context was pretty poor. Like, for example, if I have lived in, let's say I used to go to Chennai very often to work, but I did not know enough about the life there, the culture, the language, the food, right? And I think that hampers your ability to do what you're doing in a good way. Like, basically, it hampers your ability to be fully productive, even in a professional life, if you don't understand the context. Just the context cannot be just the common set of rules on which you are working, which is defined by your company or in your industry, right? I think people's personal or social context is also very critical. So I feel that if you look at these subjects, history, geography, economics, some bit of behavioral science, basically, that really gives you a very broad grounding of understanding the ambience in which you operate, and basically also to attune your responses in situations where you may read something in a very different way, but the other person could be interpreting that from their personal narrow frame of reference. So I think that people should really focus on, in my view, and obviously it comes from personal reading and personal efforts, because a lot of it is actually not taught, and it's not taught in a very good way any which way, even if it is taught. So I think a personal curiosity there makes a lot of difference.
So, earlier when it came to things like cultural sensitivity, the idea was always to understand a culture outside, right? Things like if you were to interact with someone from Europe, Asia, and so on. But do you think that we need to turn the gaze a little bit inwards now?
Yeah, I think I find it quite shameful that most Indians do not appreciate the cultures inside the country enough. It's such a large and diverse country with very rich traditions and rich beliefs and local practices, but we don't know enough. And I remember from an incident from 2000. I was working in UK in Bournemouth, which is a small coastal town. And I met like the client manager who was supervising my work. He knew so much about India. And I actually used to feel that, yeah, मुझे तो पता ही नहीं है. In 2004, he knew more than me, basically. He knew a lot more than me about even simple stuff, right? Like he had traveled in India for 2 years in his life. So he used to talk to me like a lot of old people do in Bombay. If you go from this street to that street, take a right turn, there's a tree there. So his language was of that type. And I was like, okay, I don't even know about Pune that well, right? Like just a physical city, I did not appreciate as much as he knew sitting in London. And his last visit to India was potentially like a few years ago. I think that it is changing a little bit. I think as people have moved around, thanks to the services industry and even manufacturing now getting more, let's say, wider in its catchment of talent, etc. in India. I think people have moved a little bit, which has really helped them be less cynical about cultures inside the country. It is very important because the first response when we started working, let's say 15, 20 years ago, a lot of people I realized in our generation used to scoff at what was, let's say they went to Pune, then they started bad-mouthing Pune, or they went to Chennai and started bad-mouthing Chennai for whatever reason. But no one really took the pains to understand what the context of that tradition is, or why city, like there's a Ganesh Utsav in Pune, so why do we celebrate Ganesh Utsav, right? What is the big deal about it? So I remember people used to say, hey, traffic jam, I need to leave early. I mean, the interest of your life was a very narrow personal comfort or discomfort, which really defined your personality and your worldview, which I think was fairly shallow. You can always argue that should there be traffic jams or not, but the fact is that the tradition is very integral to the city's soul. I think that people did not understand. So the same for me when I was in Chennai. Like I know more about Chennai now, having read about it after I left the city. But I actually quite love the city, despite my initial reluctance to really accept or blend in some of what was going on in the city. But I visited the place several times later on after I left the city permanently. But I think some of that is very critical. We tend to know more about, as I started by saying that, especially in the services industry, our lives are closer to, let's say, we all take Christmas holidays, or although we may not celebrate Christmas in that big a way in India. But so we don't understand our own frame of reference because something is happening. You are basically adjusting your lifestyle because of your work context. And we may know more about, let's say, London or a New York or a Zurich, depending on where you've traveled, or Singapore. But you may not know enough about, let's say, the city 200 kilometers away from you because you never went there to start off. So I think that should change. I think India does actually have fairly exciting possibilities also. The richness is so high that there's enough to learn and really appreciate.
So we'll end this conversation with a few quick takes on what we call the future relevance of X. Okay. So I'll throw out a few phrases. Just tell me what you think. Is it going to stay relevant? Is it going to morph into something very different? Maybe it will stay Lindy or not is one way to look at it. What do you think is the future relevance of management?
There'll be some relevance. The structures will change. The organizations will become flatter, and self-management will become more critical. But it's not going to go away in my view.
Okay. And related to that, the gig economy.
Fairly high. India has always been a gig economy, even before someone in New York invented the word. We always have had an army of people doing their own thing, maybe not organized in a platform sense, etc. I think gig economy is actually the future, where personal skills will be very critical. The discovery of those skills is essentially where the technology comes in. And I think that's been obviously the bane of Indian informal industry, that there's been no way to discover if I need a plumber, who's the best plumber, I don't know. But several people have always been plumbers in their professional lives and have earned their living that way. So as such, it's a fairly well-entrenched concept, and we are far ahead in the game in a structural sense in that way. Just need to create the enabling environment to really make it big in a wage benefit sense in India.
Right. And we also have the informal networks that have supported some of these.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Since I have two MBAs with me on the call, what is the future relevance of the MBA?
I can go first, Harish, and maybe you can add. But I think the relevance of the degree is different from the relevance of the place where you get a degree from. I think India, I think the latter might stay because there's some level of snootiness in the system around pedigree, and people always try to associate with people like them. That behavior may not change, in my view, significantly over the years. There's a natural tendency to trust or rely on people who you think are like you or who are your peers in a quote unquote intellectual or social sense. So I think some of that, like management, I think that tendency will stay. The degree itself, I think, is much less relevant even today. I think what it was 10 years ago. You can learn a lot of that stuff without really having to go through a 2-year formal program as such.
The future relevance of private messaging.
Maybe let's look at what Harish has to say on the MBA part, and we'll come back, Raman.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I would agree with Ashish. There is some amount of credentialing and signaling, and I think that's what it is doing at this point. That's the biggest utility of it. For the person himself or herself, it's more of the network that they get out of these business schools, which they ought to then nourish. If they don't do that, then yeah, those 2 years are wasted, in my opinion.
It's all coming back to networks again.
Yeah.
So tell us about, is the world going to fragment into smaller private messaging platforms, or how do you see that?
I don't think I'm much of a tech visionary in that sense. I don't think I really can envision that. I was reading something written by on Twitter, right? He has been a big proponent of the social media becoming fragmented or kind of cartelized, right? What his point was that either there could be some very big player or there could be many small players locally, which that cannot be governed or controlled by the regulations very, very deeply. I think that's happening in some way. Even if you look at Twitter is also, although it's all public in a single platform, but the fact is that you can actually make out that there are various parts of Twitter today, right? Like in which you operate. There could be a sports Twitter, there could be a politics Twitter, there could be an outrage Twitter. You can choose to be part of any of them, and usually they don't overlap. In fact, in that sense, the Google Plus model was way ahead of its times. Like when it launched in 2011, I would have loved to use Google Plus today as a base for my social media activity. Where when there's an IPL match, I can go and join the cricket Twitter, and they don't bother about my views on Salman Khan or politics. And when I come back and join my views on Salman Khan, they don't persecute me for not supporting, let's say, a given IPL team. So I think that distinction is not there, but it's not there because the platform is not physically designed for it, unlike Google Plus was. But I think it's already happening. So the networks might narrow down in a more performance sense over a period of time, yes.
The future relevance of public participation in politics
will increase, definitely. It has already happened. We have seen that in the last decade. I think a lot of us ourselves have probably become much more aware of what's happening around us and the root causes, or who to approach if there's a problem, stuff like that. Like when Harish has loud music going on in front of his house, he knows who to call, which I think we would not have known, say, before Twitter or say 10 years ago. By the way, this is a very common problem which both of us face, living in the same area. This is the thing is that I think there's a difference and distinction between politics and policy, which a lot of intellectuals miss out on. A lot of intellectuals approach politics only from a policy lens, while a lot of pure political animals approach it only from a political lens. There is, of course, an intersection point, which is actually where I have tried to work, and I'm trying to create some niche even in a professional sense. But there is certainly a meeting point there. But I think the importance of the two has to be understood separately. A lot of people like us do not understand the importance of pure politics. So they take everything very literally, saying, why did this person say this, or this, why was this word used or that word used? I think India is a fairly diverse country, applying some of these considerations, which a lot of times emanate in the Western worldview of very uniform thought process or conformity to a very strict adherence to a given idea. I think that may not be relevant for Indian politics, but as long as people understand that distinction and how to play around it and how to basically influence your representative in a constructive way, I think that participation will increase.
Just to break into that a little bit, what got you interested in policy? Have you always been interested in policy? And secondly, when you put together an opinion piece on something like policy, what do you do? What is the approach like?
Yeah. See, the first question was actually very, I should say, coincidental. Swaraj, which is a magazine which a couple of my friends run, Prasanna and Amar. Prasanna was also our colleague. You may not have come across him. It was on a different practice in a different city, but same organization, same years when we were there. So I know him for a while through that association, and there's a personal connect also because our wives were B school batchmates. So when he launched this, he just approached me and said that, okay, can you help out? And I had written in the past in some small forums, etc. Not that I was completely oblivious to it, but it wasn't very serious. I used to write about general stuff about current affairs or obviously sports. I had done some cricket writing earlier as well. So he said, okay, why don't you start with that? I did actually, my first few pieces for Swaraj were actually cricket and Bollywood in the first 3 months. But then as a chance thing, that was a time when the power sector discussions were going on in Supreme Court. The whole coal block allocation discussion was going on. And that I was generally interested in as an area around renewable energy. And since I come from that educational background, I understood some of that. So he said, oh no, why don't you track this part? And then if you see, want to write about power sector in general. So that's when it started. It was actually a fairly chance thing. What I realized is that there's a lot of material available in public forums, which is official government document. Basically, you should never start researching either on Wikipedia or with other media news, because a lot of those folks, as I've realized over time, are not specialists. They could be very good reporters, but they're not specialists in a domain sense. They might have acquired that skill you or I may be able to acquire, which I think I've done in a few cases. But there are enough documentation available on public platforms from the government side itself. There's a lot of discussion which happens in the parliament, which is all available. I mean, parliament website is like a goldmine, actually. If you really want to really read history, phenomenal debates, everything is documented. First of all, when the speaker says that this part of your speech will be expunged, that is actually very critical, because if you see the documents of that speech on the website, it actually says that some part was expunged or there are gaps in the documents. So it makes for fairly fascinating reading in a primary source sense. So I started relying more on that. Now, of course, I've got some context, so I know where to look for data. Like, I know who the right reporters are, who really know the subject matter. So if I'm writing about power, I know that I need to look up on 3-4 people that I trust to get things right. If it's about infrastructure, like when I wrote my book on the Maharashtra politics, I knew who the Maharashtra journalists were across publications. So I relied a lot on their writings in Indian Express, Financial Express, Hindustan Times, Bombay edition, etc. So I think that's been my approach, that you look at the primary sources first, and then look at the analysis or the views part of it later on.
All right. So finally, what is the future relevance of a generalist, someone who is probably, or the T-shaped personality, right? What is the future of that?
I actually don't think it's a problem. In fact, it's a feature in my worldview. Because I feel that networking will be critical, and ability to shift your own jobs or your own professional affiliations maybe also be very critical in the next 15-20 years until the world settles down in a different configuration, which is around gig economy. I think this is a transition time, the next, let's say, 2 decades, 3 decades. Someone who's a T-shaped person can be very effective as long as the person has the ability to narrow down very quickly. It is how a hawk operates, right? You can fly at a 30,000 feet level, but you should have the ability to zoom very quickly and basically dive into a issue very effectively in a very short span of time. So as long as you have that ability where you can really narrow down and address an issue when it is needed, which is essentially to acquire expertise or to acquire relevance when the previous relevance is shifting. I think that is good enough. But of course, that is very critical as well. It's an integral. It's not just a necessary condition. It has to be a sufficient condition in the sense that you should be able to acquire new expertise in a fairly quick. People should not worry about it too much if they think they are a journalist, but they should also know like how to deep dive when push comes to shove.
Right. So in politics, hawks are, they have a certain negativity associated with that, but I'm happy that we're ending on a version of the hawk here. It's been great, Ashish. Thank you so much for spending some time with us and talking us through what you've been up to of late and to a version of this sometime soon.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you.